Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this presentation. My name is Andrew Martinez. I'm with the Center for Court Innovation. I am a senior research associate. And today I'm going to present on a qualitative study that we conducted. And the title of this is, What Do Defendants Really Think? Procedural Justice and Legitimacy in the Criminal Justice System. So before I begin, I actually just want to say a little bit about the Center for Court Innovation. So we are located in Midtown Manhattan, probably like 10 blocks away from Times Square. So if you're ever in New York City, you want to stop by, say hi, let me know. We do a lot of criminal justice reform work, and we think of our work within three major buckets. So we have what are called operating programs. So we work closely with all the courts throughout New York City. And in those, in the different sites, within the different sites, we have various operating programs, diversion programs. And just to give like one example, we work with the court in Red Hook in Brooklyn. And for example, one of our programs is a Native American peacemaking program where people with low-level offenses will get referred to this peacemaking program. So that's an example of one of our operating programs. We also offer what's called technical assistance. So consulting, for example, sometimes we get phone calls from other jurisdictions that may give us a call. Just to give one example, we got a call from King County over in Seattle, and they wanted to they were interested in starting a Native American peacemaking program with their juvenile court through the Superior Court. And we got a phone call. So the past 6 months, I worked with Seattle in doing a formative evaluation for some of the work that they're piloting over there. And then last but not least is where I'm really situated, and that's within our research department. We have a team of about maybe 20 to 25. We do direct work with the courts throughout New York City, but also we do standalone research. So just to give you an example, we're doing a randomized control trial looking at restorative justice peace circles within 5 Brooklyn schools, and 5 are in the control group. We're doing a very in-depth grassroots in the community study on youth who have access to firearms. So we're literally going into the Bronx and trying to find gun carriers and asking them about their experiences. So we do a wide range of work, but I usually like to start off with putting some context on the work that we're engaged in at CCI. Okay, so this study the current study is about procedural justice. And so what is procedural justice? So procedural justice refers to fairness of justice procedures and interpersonal treatment of people interacting with an agency such as law enforcement. So let me just say that more simply. So in general, how do people perceive the process in which they're treated by, let's say, police? So if you have an interaction with a police officer, or you have an interaction with a prosecutor or a public defender or a judge, the perceptions of that process. Do you perceive it as fair? Do you perceive it as impartial, etc.? So fundamentally, procedural justice just is a perception of that interaction, or relates to that interaction. However, what I will say is that there's 4 dimensions of procedural justice, which I'll go into in just about a second. But if we step back, why do people comply with the law? The popular belief is that people comply with the law because they want to avoid sanctions, they want to avoid consequences, legal consequences, they want to avoid punishment. So think about our politicians or what you see in the media. You know, we want to reduce violence in our schools, for example, that we need to be tougher on crime. So that's sort of what the popular belief is. However, from a procedural justice standpoint, it's a little bit different. It's less about the outcome. People comply with the law not necessarily because of the outcome, but because of the process. The process in which they're treated when they interact with an individual or agent within the criminal justice system. So, and that's why the folks will be more likely to comply with the law. So there's 5 dimensions of procedural justice. Some of these are pretty straightforward. So number 1, respect. So if we feel that we're treated with respect, we're more likely to comply with the laws. So for example, being pulled over by a police officer. So the police officer referring to us as sir or ma'am or saying good evening. It could be something as simple as that. We now view them as more respectful, and we may be more likely to view them as legitimate, and therefore more likely for us to comply with the law. Voice. When we interact with criminal justice agents such as judges, prosecutors, public defenders, law enforcement, do we get to tell our side of the story? Are we afforded a platform to allow ourselves to be heard? Understanding. Do we understand our rights? Do we understand the criminal justice process? So if we go to court, do we understand the processes, the legal processes? Do we understand our rights? Or are we sort of confused when we go to the courthouse? Neutrality has to do with people's perceptions of the decision-making process. So in every step within the criminal justice system, there's a decision. So police officers, when they pull us over, they made a decision to pull us over. They make a decision to arrest us or give us a ticket. There's a decision that's made within the courthouse. Does the individual view those processes as neutral, or do we view those as biased? So that's what neutrality is concerned with. And the last one is what we call helpfulness. And this is kind of like a tack on within the procedural justice literature. And this has come sort of later. It's not one of the original dimensions. And it's basically the perception that criminal justice actors have an interest in one's needs or personal situation. So what I'll say last is that the procedural justice framework operates according to 3 processes. So procedural justice consists of these 5 elements. If we have these 5 elements and these 5 elements are fulfilled, then we're more likely to view the institution as legitimate. So if a police officer treats us with this respect, we voice our side of the story, we understand what's going on, we view their decision-making as neutral, we're more likely to view them as legitimate, and as a result, we will be more likely to comply with law enforcement, even if the outcome is not in our favor. Okay? So I just want to set that just to set the context. All right, so some gaps within the research literature when it comes to PJ. A lot of the research literature has focused on specific agencies. What I mean by this is the PJ literature has conducted a study that just looks at law enforcement, that just looks at perceptions of procedural justice within the court system or within corrections. However, in this study, what we do is that we try to get a sense of perceptions across all criminal justice sectors so that we obtain a more comprehensive understanding. A lot of studies have focused just on specific demographic groups such as youth, and a lot of the studies have been quantitative. For example, some of them have employed pretty complex SEM models, but what has been lacking are studies that are just more grounded in a qualitative understanding of what people say. So we could talk about procedural justice all we want. We could employ pretty complex statistical models, but at the end of the day, how is procedural justice conceptualized by defendants, especially within diverse communities that often come in contact with the criminal justice system? These are sort of the gaps that we identified in the literature, and this study is a response to that. This study is part of a larger study. The larger study consisted of about 800 or so surveys. And what I'm presenting on are just the in-depth interviews. So we conducted about 100 in-depth interviews. About 50% of them were in Newark, New Jersey, the other 50 in Cleveland, Ohio. And we just pretty straightforward asked folks about their perceptions of procedural justice during their recent encounters with the police, with the courts system, and with corrections. I highlighted police and courts because for purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on police and courts, but corrections was also a part of this, part of the study. So again, participants were asked about their recent encounters with the criminal justice system actors, such as police, courts, using a procedural justice framework. So during the interviews, the interviewers literally asked about, you know, when they, during the recent encounter with law enforcement or the courthouse, were you treated with respect? Did you have a chance to tell your side of the story? Did you understand what was going on? Do you feel that the judge was neutral? So, for example, here, a sample question is, did the police officer treat you with respect? Okay, so the interviews were conducted using this framework. In the sample, mostly they were men, 77%, primarily Black/African-American, and we had various age groups represented, from 18 to 24, all the way up to 46 to 55. So it was a nice representation across these various age group cross sections. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in straight up into the findings. When I present on the findings, I'm going to first start with police, and then I'll shift gears and present on courts. And also, as I'm presenting, I'm going to speak to the procedural justice domains as they relate to police and courts. So, for example, I'll talk first about respect, and I'll move on to voice, understanding, and so forth. However, within each of the procedural justice domains, you'll see that there's sub-themes, and these sub-themes were the themes that were generated by participants. All right, so we literally just asked participants, how did the police treat you with respect during your last encounter with them? What I will say is most people actually said that police were respectful. So contrary to popular belief, or what you see in the media, people would say, oh, police are respectful. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing a little bit more on when people said that police were not respectful, and I'm sort of unpacking what people said and what that looked like, what that looks like. So one of the things that people said is that is this whole notion of presumption of guilt. Police were reported as presuming guilt, being approached with the expectation that we did something wrong. People also talked about police being verbally and physically abusive. Police being called the N-word, being called a fat ass, being called a bitch, being called a whole wide range of derogatory terms. People also talked about police using excessive force, being hit across the head with a flashlight, handcuffs being very tight. One participant, for example, said that a police officer said, the police officer told me that he had no problem with putting a bullet in my head. So these were some of the things that people were saying. What was interesting is that even though what I'm describing here is negative, when we looked at the data, there was also just above and beyond this verbal and physical abuse, there was a heightened level, there were some examples of a heightened level of disdain, almost as being treated as subhuman. And some of these quotes reflect that. So one person said, last weekend we were cooking outside, the cop came out of the car and kicked my grill over, knocked all of the food over, and said, y'all have to eat from that. And the participant then responds, I'm not about to feed my kids nothing off the ground. Treat me like a human being. Another person said, my man died. He was sitting out there all night. He probably could have gotten saved, but the police left him out there so long that he died on the scene. So as you see, it's one thing to be treated with sort of verbal disrespect or verbal abuse or physical abuse, but it was interesting and very sad and unfortunate is that people were just citing these examples of almost being treated as subhuman, these very dehumanizing experiences with law enforcement. So some of the procedural justice categories did not have dimensions, did not have subcategories. So therefore, they're all presented on this slide. So voice, as I said earlier, has to do with the ability to tell one story. And people will just mention that not when they had a recent encounter with law enforcement, that they did not have the opportunity to have voice or tell their side of the story. So the police officer would say things like, I don't want you talking, shut up, tell it to the judge. So being very dismissive. And the issue was that people cited examples of being stopped, detained, or frisked, examples of police officers like literally stopping them, and maybe five police officers, 6, 7, 8 police officers showing up, and the person really wanting to understand why they're being stopped or approached, but the police officer is being very dismissive, like tell it to the judge, shut up, I don't want you talking. Or the other thing that would happen is that the police, actually I'll just move on, so because it's going to come up under understanding. So voice kind of overlaps with understanding, because people are trying to voice why and ask questions about why they're being pulled over, but they're sort of being dismissed. But people are just not understanding why they're being approached. Or sometimes maybe half hour later, once they don't meet the criteria or the police officer lets them go, then the police officer explains why they were approached. Participants were also asked if they felt that police officers, law enforcement, were neutral in their decision making. Interestingly, a lot of people said, yeah, police officers are pretty impartial. They approach people in a neutral fashion, but the reality is that many people didn't. People said, they were approached based on our physical appearance. If I'm wearing Jordans, if I'm wearing certain types of clothes, if my pants look big or are sagging, then I'm being approached by the police officer. I'm being automatically stopped. The color of my skin, if I have a criminal history. If I live in a specific neighborhood, police officers are just biased. They're not impartial. They automatically assume that everyone in this neighborhood of Newark is a criminal. And finally, helpfulness is sort of an anomaly. And there were a subsection of participants talked about police officers actually showing good deeds, doing small favors, such as offering them a slice of pizza, playing with kids at the basketball park. So people share these examples in which they thought that police officers just kind of took an interest in them and the community, which was nice to see. And so moving on, fairness and legitimacy is actually not one of the procedural justice dimensions, but based on the data, we created this category. And for purpose of the study, we found that people were talking about people had like these more deep-rooted or broader perceptions of law enforcement that were just broader and more general. So if we go back to what I said about procedural justice, just as a reminder, is based on episodic encounters or interpersonal encounters with, for example, a police officer that pulls you over. But what we found is that people sort of had these general beliefs about law enforcement that weren't really just based on personal encounters, but there were these overarching, deep-rooted beliefs. So, for example, people just had these broader characterizations and perceptions of police just being ineffective, such as being visible in the community, yeah, we see police officers all the time in our community. They're stopping us, they're frisking us, they're patrolling, but when we call them because we need them, they're unresponsive. So they were ineffective in that regard. Or other anecdotes in which police officers over-police for minor crimes. So, for example, having a bag of weed or being pulled over for a broken taillight. So, also participants talked about the sense of helplessness, which was interesting. And if you look at the language in which participants communicated this, and it was like this fatalistic sense of, it is what it is. This is the way things are in my neighborhood, in my community. There's nothing that we could do about it. And so it was a deep-rooted belief that, yeah, police just pull you over. They're unfair. They're going to keep targeting us based on the color of our skin. And there's nothing that we could do about it. And as a result, we view police as fundamentally unfair, and we do not believe that they are a legitimate institution. As one example, there was a 58-year-old black man who said, when I had my case, I went to internal affairs about the corrupt cops. You know what they tell me? He said, I'm going to ask you some questions. If I think for 1 minute that you're lying, I'm locking you up. I couldn't believe it. So the sense of helplessness, that there's nothing that we could do to change this situation. It's just fundamentally like this. So this is above and beyond. This has nothing to do with the last time you got pulled over by police or the last time you got frisked. These are just more fundamental, deep-rooted beliefs. Okay, so I'm switching gears here to the court system. Traditionally, procedural justice research, as I said before, has focused on just specific sectors. But as you can see here, we're asking the same participants about courts, and this is what they had to say. So court respect. We asked participants, okay, so last time you went to the court, were they respectful? Was the prosecutor respectful? Was the public defender respectful? How were you treated by the judge? Was he or she respectful, etc.? One of the interesting things is that people would say, yeah, they're respectful when you go to court. But a lot of times, it was interesting is that they base this on nonverbal cues. So, for example, the judge was respectful. Well, how so? Oh, she looks you in the eye. She gives you eye contact. He or she smiled. Her demeanor, the tone of voice. So it was really interesting that, when defendants go to court, they're probably just meeting with the judge for a couple of minutes, but within a split second, they're already making a determination as to whether the judge is respectful or not respectful, just based on these nonverbal cues, which is pretty interesting. Another example, or another thing that emerges, they talked about professionalism and etiquette. So participants would say something like, yeah, the judge called me Mr., the judge called me Miss, or ma'am, and that's an example of the judge being very respectful. Yeah, she called me ma'am. Conversely, like one participant said, no, the judge was not respectful or professional at all. He called me boy, which, as we know, has derogatory and racial underpinnings. Interestingly enough, people also talked about the use of stigmatizing labels. So the judge saying, oh, you're just a criminal. Oh, you're a menace to society. So a 26-year-old black man said, the prosecutor sent a letter to the parole board telling them I was a menace to society. I shouldn't be released from prison. That was totally disrespectful. I don't know, you don't know me from a can of paint. And by the way, I like the fact that he just makes a reference to a can of paint. Never set eyes on me, or never set eyes on you, never had a conversation with you. So it was just interesting to see that these stigmatizing labels that were used by court actors kind of reflected this elevated level of disdain. So we also asked participants, when you went to court, were you able to tell your side of the story? Did you have the space to have your voice heard? And a lot of people did, but a lot of people talked about how, in many instances, they were silenced by court actors. So this literally meant being cut off, for example, by the judge, and the judge would say something like, "Shut up, just stay quiet." The judge is not wanting to listen or not caring to listen. And especially if the defendant had a criminal justice history, a lot of times the judges in the courthouse would be very dismissive. And so these were some of the examples in which they would be silenced. So sort of just immediately disregarded within that brief interaction with the judge or their public defender. One of the interesting things is that procedural justice, as I have said all along, is based on these interpersonal interactions. One of the things that emerged out of the literature that's, I think, kind of a new way of thinking about procedural justice is what I call structural silencing. And what I mean by this is what I mean by this are sort of these systematic or systemic ways in which defendants are silenced within the courthouse or within the court system. So let me just give you some examples to bring this concept home. So people talked about, for example, I took a plea bargain. So no, I never got to share my side of the story because I took a plea bargain. And so a lot of times plea bargains are handed out as a first option by the public defender, or people just plead only because they just can't afford a lawyer. So they take a plea. So at the end of the day, their voice is never heard. And if you know anything about the criminal justice system, if you're poor and can't afford a lawyer, a lot of times these plea bargains are kind of offered as like these first options. But what it also does is that it's sort of this systematic way of silencing individuals, silencing defendants. As another example, people, it kind of overlaps with what I just said, but people can't make bail. So a lot of people talked about, I couldn't afford a lawyer, I needed a public defender. So obviously, you can't afford a public defender. Now you're detained for a week becomes 2 weeks. Lo and behold, now it becomes 6 months. You haven't spoken with your public defender, and 6 months have gone by, and you haven't had your voice heard. You haven't shared your side of the story. Now the public defender comes in who has an enormous caseload and doesn't care to hear your side of the story because they're just handing out the plea bargains as a first option. So systematically, people just aren't, there's a structural way in which, or systematic way in which people are silenced. So just to summarize this point, voice is not just about being listened to within an interpersonal space, but it's about having the platform to begin with to voice one's story. And sometimes that platform is systematically limited for certain individuals. We also asked people if they understood what was going on when they went to court. What was interesting, people often said, yeah, I understood what went on in court. I understand the court rules. Yeah, no hats. You can't chew gum in court. No talking, no cell phones. You have to say yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. So when we asked people if they understood the court process, their responses were often mundane examples that were about obedience and about understanding court rules. Where people expressed that what they didn't understand had to do with legal jargon. So people are not understanding the language used in court. People are not understanding the legal jargon, the complex terminology. Quite frankly, a lot of my research in the past has been more so with schools. Criminal justice is a little bit new to me, and quite frankly, I I needed to be brought up to speed on some of the legal jargon. So just imagine individuals with limited education, limited levels of literacy. They go to court, they're expected to, it's fast-paced, and they're expected to understand big words that are being thrown out there, many of which are legal terms that they don't understand. And last but not least, what was interesting is that people said that they understood court rules. Maybe they said that they didn't understand legal jargon, but also was lacking is that people lacked an understanding of more fundamental legal processes. So people didn't understand more fundamentally what was happening within the courthouse or what the court system processes entail. So just to give you an example, people talked about, yeah, you know, I agreed to a plea bargain, but not really understanding what a plea bargain is, not understanding fundamentally the implications or the pros and cons of a plea bargain. A 40-year-old black man said, yeah, people not understanding what no contest is and certain languages that the judges use, people don't understand and they just agree to it. Okay, so moving on, we asked people if the courts were neutral. People pretty much said, a subset of people said, yeah, the courts are neutral, they're impartial. But we, quite frankly, got a lot of people that said, no, courts are not neutral. If you have a criminal history, you're pretty much screwed. If you have a certain skin color, if you're of a certain race or ethnicity, your chances are looking less favorable. And what people expressed a lot, in many ways we all understand this and know this, is that if you don't have the income or financial means to afford a lawyer, then your prospects within the courthouse look less favorable. Interestingly, a subset of people mentioned that the courts were helpful. Occasionally, people would say, "Oh yeah, the judge was very helpful," rather than just sending me to jail or prison. They send me to a program. So there were some instances of in which people felt that the judges or court actors took an interest. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to move along. Last but not least, court fairness and legitimacy. So this is that same category that I said is not part of the original PJ research or literature, but has to do with more deep-rooted sort of structural perceptions of the system. And so people said, no, people had like these broader views or perceptions or characterizations of the court system that may or may not have had to do with their last experience in the court. So people said, look, you know, if you go to court, you're guilty until proven innocent. Courts are excessively punitive, especially for minor offenses. Interestingly, a lot of people talked about courts as being a business and being financially motivated. They express how court budgets are limited, and so they need consumers to make it to allow the court system to continue to operate. So what does the court does? They hand out fines left and right so that people can pay into the system and support the system. And it's basically the jobs of court agents, such as judges and prosecutors, are on the backs of defendants. The defendants are funding the courts. And people were literally just saying this and viewed it as a business. Racial bias, so people just viewing the court system as fundamentally, in a structural sense, fundamentally flawed and just being racially biased. And interestingly, people talked about courts just operating in a fundamentally flawed way. So people would say, the courts have high caseloads, it takes a lot, they have these high processing times, they lose your files, they lose paperwork, they're dysfunctional, they operate in a very flawed fashion. And this sort of limited the credibility and legitimacy of the court system. Okay, so just some general takeaways. I didn't talk too much about the positive, but at the end of the day, it was interesting to see that people view the justice system as positive, but at the same time negative. But I state this because if you look at the way Black and brown communities are portrayed within the community, within the media, it's kind of all negative, but people said, like, no, we like the police. We actually want them to spend time in the community. We think that there's just a few bad apples. So it was actually interesting because it was a very balanced portrayal. Another takeaway based on the study is that procedural justice is not just based on these episodic and interpersonal encounters, but structural factors matter. So it's one thing to say, yeah, police officer, the last time police officers pulled me over, yeah, I'll talk about that experience. In a way, like, as a person with more privilege, maybe that's my experience of the criminal justice system. I could think back maybe a few years ago when was the last time that I got pulled over. But for some communities, it's not episodic. It's a way of living. Some folks are stopped and frisked almost every day or as a weekly or monthly occurrence as they're going to work or school. So for procedural justice, we got to get away from this notion that it's episodic, but it's actually more systematic. So if you're stopped and frisked, quite frequently, it's not just this episodic encounter. So we need to move away from that sort of thinking. And I think that a contribution of the study is just a better understanding how procedural justice is conceptualized within the Black and brown communities that tend to be more diverse and tend to be more disenfranchised. And quite frankly, when we look at how people are talking about procedural justice, if we look at how people talk about respect and bias and neutrality or understanding lack thereof, what we're seeing is we're really fundamentally seeing issues of power and oppression at play. We're seeing issues of races coming up, being basically Black and poor. Like these are some of the fundamental issues that we're seeing, and it kind of fundamentally comes into this dynamic of power and oppression. Policy recommendations, I'll try to be brief. There's many more, but I'll just kind of go through these, and I'm curious to see what others also think. More police training on implicit bias and nonverbal communication. We need to lessen the police community divide, so more efforts for community policing, for example, because people are saying, we're treated this way, but if police spend more time in the community, they'll understand us better. In terms of courts, distributing materials within the courts that understand court processes. So this could be as simple as brochures, or maybe having a point person or clerk who could explain court processes when people show up to court. Judges having more training and scripts so that they're more mindful of how they're interacting with defendants, more mindful of nonverbal cues. We put at the Center for Court Innovation, we put out a book, it's called To Be Fair, where judges were interviewed across the country. And I forget right now what jurisdiction it was, but one of the jurisdictions, what they did for judges in their first year is that they would actually videotape the judges, and they would have the judges look at their nonverbal cues and their interactions with defendants so that they could be more mindful of how they convey maybe bias, respect, or disrespect based on these video clips, which I thought was a pretty creative effort. And last but not least, just more adequate funding for defense attorneys, because at the end of the day, defense attorneys or public defenders tend to have high caseloads, so it's hard. So oftentimes the quality of the interactions are limited. Let's just open it up, okay? We could take off put on the mics, but I'm just kind of curious as to any questions that people have. How might community psychologists be interested in PJ? Procedural justice has been new to me this past year. I'm wondering if other people have heard about this. Does this apply to your work? Yes or no? So I am opening up the table.
Thank you, Andrew.
I was just going to say that you had a question from Tom, who doesn't seem to be here anymore. Did you do interviews with pre-trial or pre-transport offenders?
Pre-trial, pre-transport. So one of my disclaimers is that I actually wasn't part of the daily collection of this. I kind of came on board after. No, I think it was primarily no. It was, I believe it was post-trial.
And then I had a question. What is your organization planning on doing with this information? Because one thing that struck me was something that seems clear in retrospect, that treating community members with more respect would make the job of people working within the criminal justice system a lot easier.
Right. Sure. So for the latter point, my short answer is yes, I agree. Like treating people with respect doesn't cost much, and it's just based on your interaction. What do we plan to do with this? So we are very soon putting out a report that has the same title of this presentation. All right. So one of the things that we'll do is that we're putting out a report. The other thing that that I'll say is that we are very actively involved with the courts within New York City, but also across the nation. Here and there's different courts that are interested in being more procedurally just, and they're coming to us and saying, how could we be more PJ friendly? So just one example is there's a court, for example, there's an intervention right now at 100 Center Street in Manhattan where there's this whole makeover of the courthouse and trying to put, for example, more signage. So as one example, the benches when you go to court, there'll be signs like in the bench in front of you, so the back side of the bench that's in front of you, and there'll be little signage or little I describe it like, I guess little signs that will list some of the defendant's rights. Out in the hallway, there'll be signage of explaining court processes. So these are just sort of examples that have to do with the built environment. One of my critiques about that is that that's fine, but does signage really get at the fundamental understanding of people understanding the court system? So you could have signage, but at the end of the day, are plea bargains being thrown out left and right, and people are agreeing to them without really understanding what a plea bargain is. So is that really being explained? So to summarize my response is we're putting out a report. We are engaged in some interventions with courthouses, but some of my critique is that there has to be more fundamental, critical intervention in which we're really getting at fundamentally, are defendants really being treated with respect? Are they really given a voice? Are they really understanding? Does that answer some of your question?
Definitely some of it. I was thinking more on lines of getting this information out in a way that would be heard and could be heard effectively by the people who are doing the the day-to-day contact with members of the community, police officers,
Mhm.
parole officers, other people who could benefit from just hearing this message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll say about that is that some of this information and also other related information has been brought back to the community. So for example, a lot of faith-based organizations were really, in Newark, were really curious to hear what was coming out of this because they're engaged in a lot of just sort of grassroots work, trying to improve police and community relations. So it's happened with a lot of sort of more grassroots groups. I'm not sure, quite frankly, if it's been taken to the law enforcement in Newark. So yeah, some of that has been happening. I haven't been too involved with that, however.
I think, your example of judges being videotaped and getting feedback on their nonverbal cues is really impressive. One of the questions that I had that I ended up crossing off is, how do you teach nonverbal cues? And there's my answer. That's one way to teach nonverbal cues.
Right.
I know, so I do a lot of work in the juvenile justice system.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of an answer to your question, how is procedural justice kind of operationalized and a concern there? I see them a couple of things. One, they're concerned with actually being fair. So the group here has worked with the Burns Institute, which is trying to eliminate racial disparity in juvenile justice. And so they're implementing, and I think structured decision making you're seeing around the country. But that's one way they're getting at this. They're less concerned about the perception of racial bias, but the actual racial bias. Their stats show, yes, there are disparate effects, based on race, and they're trying to use this matrix to help guide judges away from going with their gut or their intuition and into a more structured way of deciding, sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I thought speaks to your question about kind of knowledge or understanding is I guess it's a group, a project called Family Navigators that did come out of New York, and Lucas County is one of a couple places trying to replicate it. And so what that is volunteers, that some of them are part-time workers who have had kids of their own in the system who are kind of long out, and so it's behind them now. Mm-hmm. And one kind of hitch they ran into is the lawyers really don't want them explaining the legal proceedings to the families, so the family navigators, even basic legal terms, they have experience at the court, they kind of know what some of these terms mean, but they're not lawyers. And so the lawyers pushed back, and there had to be some negotiating within the system. How can family navigators do their job, help educate parents and help them navigate the system without stepping into the shoes of that they're not trained to step into?
And I'm assuming pretty much the prosecutors don't want them.
I don't remember whether it was I would assume that based on kind of how overloaded public defenders tend to be. But it's also possible there may have been one case where a family navigator gave bad advice. That would have been enough.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. Yeah, interesting. And what was the organization that Family Navigators? But that's what they're called. What's the organization? Or
that's the program. So here in Toledo, it's a faith-based organization that's running it.
Okay, I can always look that up. That's really interesting, though.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, is the PJ sort of framework, do people know this framework? Have you heard of it? Have you worked with it? I
don't hear that term being thrown around.
Okay.
Even people who are clearly, that is what they're talking about, making sure that their process and their system is fair, rather than, is the outcome fair? But yes, the outcome, but okay. Really focus on, they're just not using those words necessarily in my locality.
Okay, I'm just curious. That's interesting. What does this mean for community psychology? I'm just curious what people think or have to say. I think like some of this also like overlaps with some of our values, but I'm just curious is there, I don't know, how might community psychologists be interested in this concept, if at all?
I can talk all day. I want to give other people a chance to respond.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a clarifying question kind of related to that.
Sure.
It sounded like there was use of some kind of participatory research methods. So you talked about, I think I heard this correctly, that some of the participants were involved in either the interpretation or kind of the use of the results. And so I think that that's something that, you know, is very, very true in terms of some of the methodology that we tend to use in community psych. And so I don't know if you could elaborate that on a little bit, or I think it's just would be a really interesting model to use in other areas.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly, but
Mhm.
are you, when you mentioned participatory, are you asking if we sort of did like credibility checks with like the community to make sure like our themes are sort of aligned with what people are saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think participatory can look different in different studies,
Sure.
but that would definitely be part of it. I was just trying to kind of maybe get a better understanding of how it was used for you, but then also seeing how that, you're asking kind of how it aligns with community psych, and I think that would be one of the ways as a methodology that we tend to see.
Yeah, yeah. And well, you know, I'm just community psychologists as applied researchers, in terms of our values, taking this back to the community, you know. So I mentioned credibility in terms of, you know, checking with the community. Do these themes align? Do these themes that we're finding align with what you're saying, and just kind of checking in, but also just bringing it back to the community. Okay, yeah. Anyone else?
I think for myself, I feel a lot of the time like, you know, my community psychology training has helped me see the big picture and see that, you know, justice systems are very complicated systems, lots of interlocking pieces. And so to go in as an organizational psychologist who actually cares about social justice and issues of, you know, power and oppression, I think that gives us a unique set of skills that we can apply within these complicated systems.
Okay. And, you know, just to share some of my thoughts also, like as I went through I came on board mostly with the data analysis of this because the data collection was already over when it was over and completed when I came on board. But, you know, we work here with a lot of lawyers and a lot of the conversation about procedural justice has been more about these interpersonal interactions, these episodic encounters. And when I look at the literature, at the transcripts, I don't know how much of this is because of my community psychology background or how much is it because of the way I think about things, but I started seeing things that were more structural and systematic, which kind of is a bit different from some of the internal lingo here. And so and I could think of one conversation here where a lawyer who's a head of our department in research said, oh, you know, this report that you guys put together actually made me think a little bit differently about procedural justice, because I think about it, I don't think about it as much as these in a structural sense as much. So, I mean, that's a small caveat, but I kind of wear that lens.
I think that's a good point. We are out of time. I feel like we could keep this going for a while. So we'll meet up at the next scrod.
Yeah, sure.
Jean put up a comment in the chat box that I'll forward to you by email.
Okay.
To see if we can kind of disseminate some more information about your project. But,
sure. And look, I'm happy to share the report with folks when it comes out. It's just about to be released. I think it's being reviewed by the funder. If anyone ever wants to have a phone conversation about any of this, I'd be happy. Look up our website if there's any products that interest you or you want to learn more. Or, hey, if you're a tourist and you're just in Manhattan, feel free to stop by because I am in the tourist hot spot. Okay.
Excellent.
All right.
Andrew, if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way to contact you?
Oh, okay. Should I just dictate my email or?
Sure, just.
Okay. So it's AN, so N as in Nancy, Martinez with a Z, at NY, such as New York, nycourts.gov.
Okay.
All right. So nycourts.gov.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate your time and your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Say what?
you.
Okay.